The ceremony had already begun when Councilor Vaynot felt the first tremor in her hands. She pressed them flat against the cool surface of her armrest, fingers splayed, and watched the grand processional doors at the far end of the chamber swing inward on their counterweighted hinges. Light flooded the aisle. Daylight from the atrium beyond, harsh and unforgiving, backlit the figure standing in the threshold and turned everything about him into silhouette. 12 years. 12 years since the vote, since the unanimous resolution, since she had raised her hand along with 641 other members of the Interstellar Senate and declared Marcus Calloway exiled from sovereign territory, stripped of diplomatic standing, barred from communication with any Senate-recognized species. She remembered the way his face had looked when the count was read. Not angry, not broken, just still. And now he was back. The Senate chamber of the Valori Compact was a structure designed to project dominion. Tiered seating rose in concentric arcs from the central floor, carved from black mineral stone, polished to a gloss that reflected the enormous glass dome overhead. Through that dome, the pale morning sky of Valor Prime stretched wide and empty, tinged violet at the edges where the atmosphere thinned. Holographic displays lined the walls at intervals, currently showing the formal seal of the Senate in slow rotation. The air smelled of ozone and the faint chemical sweetness the Valori exuded when they were anxious, though most of the 700 councilors seated in their formal robes would have denied the emotion if asked. Vaynot could smell it. She could smell it on herself. The processional marshal, a career functionary named Doral, struck his ceremonial staff against the stone floor 3 times. The sound cracked through the chamber like a bone breaking. The Senate recognizes the petitioner Marcus Calloway, formerly of the human delegation, recalled by formal summons under Article 91 of the Compact Procedural Code. The petitioner will approach the audience dais. Calloway walked, he did not hurry. He was older than she remembered. The last time she had seen him, he had been 46, lean, dark-haired, his bearing that of a man who had spent 2 decades navigating rooms full of people who considered him a lesser species and had learned to carry himself as though the assessment did not register. Now he was 58. The hair was gray at the temples and thinner across the crown. His face had weathered in the way human faces did, lines carving deeper at the eyes and mouth, the skin losing the taut smoothness of youth. He wore a plain dark suit, no insignia, no rank markers. His hands were empty. He reached the dais and stopped, stood in the column of light that fell from the dome above and settled on his shoulders like something he had been fitted for. The light was warm, almost golden, filtered through the dome's treated glass, and it caught the worn fabric of his suit, the thread slightly frayed at the left cuff, the collar not quite sitting flat. These were details that should not have been visible from the 4th tier, but Vaynot noticed them because she was looking for signs of defeat and finding none. His clothes were not expensive. His posture was not defiant. He simply stood the way a man stands when he has stopped trying to impress anyone, and has been standing that way long enough that it has become the only way he knows. The Senate aisle was 70 meters long. He had walked it without deviating, without slowing, without looking at the councilors on either side. On the 1st tier, Senior Councilor Meredith produced a low clicking that Vaynot recognized as contempt. On the 6th tier, a military advisor with field scarring on his cranial ridge was watching the human with the particular intensity of someone cataloging a threat. Though what kind of threat a single unarmed human could pose to a chamber of 700 was a question the advisor would have struggled to answer. Vaynot's hands pressed harder against the armrest. She was seated in the 4th tier legislative section, her robes the deep teal that marked the policy caste. Her skin was the mottled gray-blue common to the Valori, stretched over the high cranial ridge that gave her species their distinctive elongated profile. Her eyes were wide-set, dark, evolved for peripheral vision in the dense forests of Valor's temperate belt. She had held her seat for 31 years. She had voted on trade agreements, military authorizations, quarantine protocols, and species status reviews. She had never once questioned a vote after casting it. Until 4 years ago, when the first report had crossed her desk. She remembered where she had been sitting when she read it. Her office on the 73rd terrace, morning light through the window, a cup of brewed Kelon cooling beside her hand. The report was flagged as a routine intelligence summary, the kind that crossed her desk by the dozen. She had almost not opened it. The subject line read, Human Exile Informal Trade Network Assessment. She had opened it because the word human caught her eye the way a stone catches your foot on a familiar path. You know the path, you know every turn, and then there is the stone. She had not thought about Marcus Calloway in 8 years. That was the truth of it, and the truth shamed her now in a way it had not shamed her then. 8 years in which the exile of a human envoy had settled into the category of resolved matters, a file closed, a vote recorded, a page turned. She had not paused over it during quiet moments. She had not felt a twinge of doubt at diplomatic receptions when the human delegation's empty chairs were discreetly removed from the seating arrangement, and no one commented on their absence. The report was dry, technical, compiled by a junior analyst in the Senate Intelligence Bureau, who had probably not understood its significance. It described a series of informal trade agreements established in the rimward sector between 4 quarantined species and an unaffiliated human operative. The operative was not named in the body of the report, only in the classification header. Subject CALLOWAY-MARCUS. Exile status, active. Current location, Commercial Station KORRETH 7, RIMWARD Quadrant. The agreements were small. Mineral extraction rights shared between the Tesseract and the Almari. Agricultural surplus exchanges between the Dren and the Cavathi. A joint shipping protocol that allowed cargo vessels from any partner species to use each other's docking infrastructure without tariff. Nothing that would have registered as significant on the Senate floor, where trade deals were measured in galactic-scale volumes and strategic resource allocations. But the structure was unusual. The analyst had noted it in a footnote almost as an afterthought. The agreements did not follow the hierarchical template that characterized compact-sanctioned trade arrangements. There was no senior partner, no client species tier, no preferential allocation based on technological development rating. The agreements were bilateral, reciprocal, equal. Vaynot had read the footnote twice. Then she had closed the report and sat in silence while her Kelon went cold. That was the moment the tremor had started, not in her hands, in her certainty. On the floor below, Doral completed the formal introduction. Senate President Corval, seated at the elevated bench at the chamber's apex, looked down at Calloway with the particular expression, the Velori reserved for things they found distasteful but procedurally unavoidable. Corval was old, his cranial ridge almost translucent with age, his robes trimmed with the silver thread that indicated supreme judicial authority. He had held the presidency for 9 years and governed the chamber the way a surgeon governed an operating table, with the calm expectation that everything would go exactly as planned. The petitioner is here to address the Senate on the matter of his exile and the subsequent diplomatic developments arising from that period, Corval said. His voice was dry, clipped, carrying the practiced neutrality of a man who had already decided the outcome. This is a formal audience, not a trial. The petitioner may speak but has no standing to introduce motions, call witnesses, or invoke procedural challenge. Is this understood? Calloway looked up at Corval. Then he looked at the tiers, row by row, level by level. Vaynot felt his gaze pass over her section and kept her face still, though the chemical scent in the chamber intensified by a fraction she hoped no one else would notice. Understood, Calloway said. Then you may begin. Calloway did not begin. He stood on the dais in silence for 4 full seconds, which in a chamber of 700 was long enough for the rustling to start, for the low clicking of Valori throat plates to ripple through the tiers. 4 seconds of a human saying nothing while an entire Senate waited. Then he reached into the inner pocket of his suit and produced a thin data tablet. He set it on the edge of the dais podium and left it there. 12 years ago, he said, this body voted to exile the human delegation from compact territory. The stated reason was that I had exceeded my diplomatic mandate by proposing a mutual security framework without authorization from my government. Corval's expression did not change. That is the record. The record is accurate, Calloway said. I did propose that framework, and I did not have authorization. A sound moved through the tiers. It was the Valori equivalent of exchanged glances, a low harmonic clicking that communicated confusion. An exile returning to a formal audience and immediately confirming the charges against himself was not a recognized move in the Senate's procedural vocabulary. Vaynot's throat tightened. She had expected denial. She had prepared herself for denial, had rehearsed in her mind the way she would sit through his protestations of innocence and weigh them against what she now knew. But he was not denying it. He was confirming it. The second report had arrived 6 months after the first. This one was not routine. It was a classified assessment from the Senate's own Trade Analysis Division, flagged for senior legislative members only. The subject line was longer. RIMWARD Sector Trade Realignment, Human LINKED Informal Network, Economic Impact Projection. Vaynot had read it at her desk, the same desk, a fresh cup of Kellon beside her hand, and by the time she finished, the Kellon was cold and her hands were shaking. The numbers were not dramatic, they were precise. The human exile had, over the course of 8 years, established trade relationships with 4 species that the Senate had placed under quarantine restrictions. The tesserat, the almari, the dren, the cavathi. Each species had been quarantined for different reasons, some economic, some political, some a combination of both. What they had in common was that the Senate had cut them off from galactic trade networks, and in the vacuum left by that isolation, a single exiled human with no resources, no fleet, and no diplomatic standing had walked in and offered them something the Senate never had. Partnership. Not patronage, not client species management, not the tiered hierarchy of the compact where species were ranked by technological development and contribution capacity and assigned standing accordingly. Partnership. Equal terms, shared risk, mutual benefit. The numbers showed the informal network was small, roughly 3% of Rimward sector trade volume. But the growth trajectory was steep, projections reaching 8% within 4 years and 12 within 7. The Trade Analysis Division had flagged it not because of its current size, but because of its structure. It was decentralized. It had no single point of failure. It operated entirely outside the compact's regulatory framework, and it was growing faster than any Senate-sanctioned trade bloc had grown in the previous century. The report's final paragraph was the one that had made her hands shake. It noted that the exile of the human delegation, intended to remove human influence from the compact sphere, had instead created the conditions for an alternative framework that the compact could not regulate, sanction, or effectively counter without military action that would violate 7 existing treaties. The Senate had exiled Marcus Calloway to make him disappear. Instead, it had given him exactly what he needed: 12 years, 4 willing partners, and the moral clarity of a man who had nothing left to lose. On the floor below, Calloway was speaking. His voice was even, unhurried, carrying the way a human voice did in a chamber designed for Valori acoustics, pitched slightly lower than the room expected, cutting through the ambient hum with the plainness of unpolished stone. "I'm not here to argue the legality of my exile," he said. "The vote was lawful. The procedure was followed. I exceeded my mandate and the Senate exercised its authority. I accepted the consequence then, and I accept it now. Corval's left hand twitched. Among the Valori, that particular movement indicated surprise poorly concealed, and Vaynot saw at least 3 other senior members on the first tier register it. An exile who accepted his exile was not performing to script. What I am here to discuss, Calloway continued, is what happened after. He picked up the data tablet from the podium and held it up, not dramatically, just high enough for the chamber to see it. This tablet contains the complete trade records, partnership agreements, and resource-sharing protocols of what the Senate's Intelligence Division has been calling the Rimward Informal Network. I'm not going to read them to you. They're available for Senate review under the terms of my audience petition, and I expect your analysts will have them within the hour. He set the tablet back down. What I want to talk about is something that isn't in the records, something this body decided 12 years ago that it has never revisited, and that decision is costing the Valori Compact more than anyone in this chamber wants to admit. The clicking in the tiers changed register. Higher, more irregular, the chemical scent in the air sharpened. A councilor on the second tier, a senior member of the military advisory section, activated her holographic display and began pulling up data. Then another on the third tier. Then 3 more across the 5th and 6th. Vaynot felt her pulse in her temples, a steady throb against the thin skin of her cranial ridge. She knew what was coming. She had known since she read the 3rd report, the one that had arrived on her desk 11 months ago, and had not been a routine intelligence summary or a classified trade assessment, but something far worse. It had been a petition from the Tesseract, a formal, diplomatically composed petition addressed to the Valori Compact Senate, requesting that the quarantine imposed on Tesseract trade routes be reviewed, and if found to be without current justification, lifted. The petition cited the economic data, the growth of the informal network, the demonstrable viability of partnership-based trade models, and the precedent of 3 other quarantine species who had achieved stable economic growth outside the Compact's framework. The petition was polite, measured, precisely constructed in the formal diplomatic register that the Tesseract had learned from a human exile living on a cargo station. And attached to the petition as a supporting document was a letter, not from the Tesseract government, not from the Almery Provincial Council, not from any species or institution that the Senate recognized. From Marcus Calloway. The letter was short, 7 sentences, no demands, no accusations, no rhetoric. It simply stated that the informal network was willing to integrate with the Compact's trade framework, on the condition that the quarantine restrictions be reviewed on their merits rather than their political utility, and that any species found to have been quarantined without current economic or security justification be granted full trade standing. 7 sentences, no anger, no plea. She had shown the letter to Councilor Yvonne, the elderly jurist on the second tier, because Yvonne was the only colleague she trusted to read it without immediately calculating its political implications. Yvonne had read it once, set the tablet down, and said, "He is offering us a door we do not deserve." Vaynot had not responded. She had not needed to. Yvonne's assessment was precise. The letter was not a demand or a threat or a negotiating position. It was a door, held open by a man who had every reason to let it close, for a body that had given him every reason to walk away. And attached to the letter was a second supporting document, a list of every species status review that the Senate had conducted in the past 50 years, with outcomes noted. 43 entries, 39 resulted in no change, 4 resulted in status downgrades. Not a single quarantine species had been upgraded in half a century. The list carried no commentary. The numbers wrote their own conclusion. The Compact species status system was not a framework for evaluation. It was a framework for preservation. Vaynot had read it 4 times and then walked to the window of her office and stood there looking out at the city below, at the tiered buildings and the transit lines and the citizens moving through their morning routines, and she had thought, we did this. We created this. We took a man who wanted to be our partner, threw him out, and he built something that is now asking us politely to be better than we were. She had felt something then that the Valori language did not have a precise word for. The closest translation was a compound, the weight of a decision understood too late, but even that missed the quality of it, the specific, private, inescapable recognition that she had been wrong, not manipulated, not misled, not acting on incomplete information. Wrong. She had voted to exile a man for proposing what she now understood to be the most reasonable diplomatic initiative to cross the Senate floor in 3 decades. And she had done it because the chamber had expected her to, because the consensus had been clear, because voting against the exile would have marked her as sympathetic to an upstart client species, and the career cost of that sympathy had seemed, at the time, too high to pay. She had been a coward. The word existed in Valori, and she did not flinch from it in the privacy of her own mind. On the floor, Calloway had stopped speaking. The silence was deliberate, the kind of silence a human used the way the Valori used their ceremonial clicking, to mark a transition, to signal that what came next was different from what came before. The Tesseract petition has been on this Senate's docket for 11 months, he said. It has not been scheduled for debate. It has not been assigned to committee. It has not been acknowledged. He looked at Corval. I'm told the procedural term is deferred without prejudice, which, in my experience of this body's language, means it will sit in a queue until the species that filed it gives up or the political cost of ignoring it exceeds the political cost of addressing it. The clicking in the tiers stopped. The chamber was silent in the way that meant something had landed. Corval's expression was unchanged, but his hands had moved from the armrests to the surface of the bench in front of him, palms flat, fingers spread. Among the Valori, that posture meant control being actively maintained. His arbiter leaned toward him and murmured something too quiet for the chamber to catch, but the tension in Corval's shoulders tightened a fraction. The petitioner will confine his remarks to the scope of his audience petition, Corval said, which is the matter of his exile, not the internal scheduling of Senate business. The scope of my exile, Calloway said, is the scope of your Senate's business. You exiled me because I proposed something this body wasn't ready for. In the 12 years since, the galaxy has moved. 4 quarantine species are trading, building, cooperating, growing. They're doing it without the Compact's permission, without the Compact's oversight, and without the Compact's approval. And the only reason they're doing it is because you threw me out, and I had nothing to do, but the work this body refused to let me do inside these walls. A councilor on the 6th tier stood abruptly, robes catching on the edge of the seat. Vaynot recognized him, Senator Thrall, Military Advisory Section, a hawk who had been one of the loudest voices in favor of the exile 12 years ago. His cranial ridge was flushed dark, the capillaries distending in the way that indicated agitation barely held in check. Point of order, Thrall said. The petitioner is characterizing Senate decisions. He has no standing to interpret the motivations of this body. Corval's response was immediate. The point is noted. The petitioner will confine himself to facts. Calloway looked at Thrall, held the look for 2 seconds, then turned back to Corval. Facts then. Vaynot watched Thrall sit down. His hands were gripping the armrests in the same way hers had been gripping hers since the doors opened. But Thrall's grip came from a different place. Thrall was afraid, and his fear was the specific fear of a man who had staked his career on a decision and was watching the foundation of that decision erode in real time. She had sat beside Thrall in the committee session that had drafted the exile resolution. She remembered his voice, the clipped certainty of it, the way he had framed the exile not as a punitive measure but as a strategic realignment. Humanity is a client species, he had said. Client species do not propose security partnerships. The proposal itself is an act of insubordination. The precedent must be corrected. She had nodded. She had not spoken, but she had nodded, and in a committee of 12, a nod was a vote. Calloway continued, I'm not going to catalog the network's trade volumes. Your analysts can do that from the tablet. What I want to discuss is something your analysts won't find in the data because it was never recorded. He reached into his jacket and produced a second item, not a data tablet, a single sheet of paper, actual paper, not a screen, not a holographic display, a flat, white, physical sheet with text printed on it. The sight of it produced a reaction in the chamber that the data tablet had not. Paper was archaic. Paper was a human medium, alien to the Valori, who had not used physical documents in 600 years. The act of producing it in the Senate chamber was not merely unusual. It was a statement. It said, this is not in your systems. This has not been filtered through your networks. This exists outside your control. Councilors on the lower tiers leaned forward. Even Thrall's posture shifted, the aggression replaced by something closer to wariness. The chemical scent in the air thickened. Vaynot could taste it now, the acrid sweetness coating the back of her tongue. Calloway held the paper up. 12 years ago, when this Senate voted to exile me, I was given 7 hours to vacate compact territory. I was allowed to take one personal bag. Everything else, my diplomatic files, my correspondence, my working notes, was seized and sealed under Corval's predecessor's authority. I was told it would be archived. He lowered the sheet. It wasn't archived. It was destroyed. I know this because 3 years into my exile, a Senate clerk contacted me through a back channel and told me so. The clerk's name doesn't matter. What matters is what was in those files. The chemical scent spiked. Vaynot saw Corval's jaw tighten, the thin muscles along his cranial ridge contracting in a pattern she recognized. The involuntary reflex of a Valori who had just heard something he wished he had not heard in a room full of witnesses. My files contained the original mutual security proposal that I submitted to this body before my exile. The full text, not the summary that was read into the record during my trial. The full proposal, including the annexes that detailed the security threats I was trying to address. He held up the paper again. This is a reconstruction. I wrote it from memory during my first year of exile, while the details were still fresh. It's not identical to the original, but it's close. And what it describes is a set of military threats to the Rimward sector that I identified during my time as envoy. He set the paper on the podium beside the data tablet. In the 12 years since my exile, every threat I identified in that proposal has materialized. Vaynot closed her eyes. She did not want to hear the list. She already knew it. She had compiled it herself, on a night 3 months ago when she could not sleep, and had sat at her desk pulling intelligence reports from the Senate archive one by one, matching them against the rumors and back-channel briefings she had been collecting since the first tremor in her certainty 4 years earlier. Everyone, Calloway said. The Tesseract were raided by a Kethon pirate syndicate in year 4, 14 dead, 3 cargo convoys destroyed. The Almery lost a mining colony to unlicensed mercenary action in year 6, 211 colonists displaced. The Dren were blockaded by a rogue fleet in year 9, cutting off food supply lines to 3 of their outer settlements for 47 days. And the Cavathi suffered an orbital bombardment of their secondary agricultural world in year 11. The bombardment destroyed 38% of that world's growing capacity. 17,000 Cavathi were affected. 41 died from starvation-related causes in the months that followed. The clicking and the tears was gone. The chamber was silent in a way that Vaynot had never heard before, not in 31 years of service. Not silent as in quiet. Silent as in held breath. Silent as in 700 people confronted with a list of numbers they had seen before, individually in classified briefings and intelligence summaries, but had never heard spoken aloud in sequence, in this chamber, by the man they had exiled. Senator Thrall was on his feet again. These events occurred in quarantine zones, outside compact jurisdiction. The Senate bears no responsibility for security conditions in regions where compact authority does not extend. Calloway looked at him. That is technically correct. The word technically landed in the chamber the way a door closes in an empty corridor. The sound was small. The silence after it was not. Thrall sat down, but Vaynot could see from his posture that he had not conceded. He had merely recognized that the ground he was standing on had shifted, and he was reassessing. Around him, in the military advisory section, 4 other councilors were engaged in rapid low-volume clicking, the military caste's version of a whispered argument. Vaynot could not make out the specifics from the 4th tier, but the pattern was familiar. 1 voice asserting, 3 voices questioning, the clicking accelerating and then stopping abruptly as all 4 realized they were being watched. On the 2nd tier, Councilor Yvonne was sitting motionless, her ancient hands folded in her lap, her deep-set eyes fixed on the human below. Vaynot had seen Yvonne listen to thousands of hours of Senate debate in the 40 years the jurist had held her seat. She had never seen Yvonne listen like this, with the total stillness that the Valori reserved for moments they understood to be irreversible. Below them, a clerk at the recording station was transcribing Calloway's words into the permanent record. The clerk's hands were moving quickly, the stylus trembling slightly, and Vaynot realized that the clerk was young, perhaps 10 years into service, and was experiencing something that the older members of the chamber had long since learned to suppress. The visceral recognition that the words being spoken were the kind that would be read and reread for decades, quoted in committee hearings and legislative reviews, and the private memoranda of councilors who had not yet been born. Each of those events, Calloway continued, was addressed by the informal network. The Tesseract piracy was countered by a joint patrol system funded by the Almery and crewed by Dren volunteers. The Almery mining colony was resupplied by Cavathi cargo vessels running under Tesseract escort. The Dren blockade was broken by a coordinated response from all 4 partner species within 19 days, and the Cavathi bombardment was answered by a humanitarian relief operation that I personally coordinated from a borrowed office on a cargo station, using communication equipment loaned by the Tesseract, running on power supplied by the Almery, staffed by volunteers from all 4 species. He paused. Let the chamber absorb the architecture of that sentence. 4 species, 4 contributions, 1 human coordinating from a borrowed office, against a background of crises that the Senate had classified, filed, and forgotten. Every one of those crises was preventable, Calloway said. Every one of them was the kind of threat that a mutual security framework, the framework I proposed to this body 12 years ago, was designed to address. And every one of them happened because this Senate decided that the political cost of partnering with humanity was higher than the security cost of leaving 4 species unprotected in a region of space you knew was dangerous. Vaynot felt the weight of it settle, not on the chamber, on her. Specifically and precisely on her in the 4th tier, 7th seat, where she had sat for 31 years and raised her hand when the chamber expected her to raise it. She had known about the Tesseract raids. She had read the intelligence briefings. She had seen the casualty figures, the 14 dead listed in a subparagraph of a quarterly security digest that she had reviewed between committee meetings, scanning the numbers the way you scan weather data for a region you do not live in. Noted. Filed. Next item. She had known about the Almery colony. 211 displaced. She had read that number in a footnote to a trade impact assessment and had not stopped reading. She had known about the Dren blockade, 47 days, the food supply disruption, the rationing protocols the Dren had improvised using agricultural techniques they had learned from the human exiles network. She had known about the Cavathi bombardment, the 38% crop destruction, the 17,000 affected, the 41 dead, and she had done nothing, because doing something would have required her to confront the vote she had cast 12 years ago, and confronting that vote would have required her to admit that it had been wrong, and admitting that would have cost her things she had spent 31 years accumulating. Standing influence, the respect of colleagues who had also raised their hands and did not wish to be reminded. 41 dead. She had read the number and moved on to the next report. She had moved on because the Cavathi were quarantined, and quarantined species were, by definition, not the Senate's problem. That was the logic. That was the architecture of absolution. The vote that exiled Calloway was the same vote that absolved the Senate of responsibility for the consequences. The quarantine was both sword and shield. It cut species off from compact protection and simultaneously freed the compact from any obligation to protect them. Calloway had seen through that architecture 12 years ago. He had seen it and tried to dismantle it with a proposal, and the Senate had dismantled him instead. And now Vaynot sat in the fourth tier and thought about the Cavathi bombardment in particular, because that was the one that had finally broken something inside her that she had been holding together with procedural logic and career arithmetic for a decade. The bombardment had happened 14 months ago. She had read about it in a priority intelligence brief. The details were clinical. An unidentified fleet had entered the Cavathi secondary agricultural world's orbital space and commenced a 3-hour bombardment that targeted grain storage facilities, irrigation infrastructure, and seed vaults. Seed vaults. She had stopped reading at that detail and sat very still for a long time. The Cavathi were an agrarian species. Their civilization was built around 9,000 years of careful genetic crop husbandry. The seed vaults contained backup strains for 1,100 varieties of food crops, some of which existed nowhere else in the galaxy. The bombardment had destroyed 4 of the 6 vaults. When Vaynot had recovered from the initial shock, she had looked for the Senate's response. She had searched the committee records, the floor proceedings, the interdepartmental memoranda. She had found nothing. The intelligence was in the system, properly filed, properly classified, properly routed. It had been received, catalogued, and ignored. The Cavathi were quarantined. Their security was not the Senate's responsibility. The system had processed the death of 41 people and the destruction of 9,000 years of agricultural heritage the same way it processed a weather report from an uncharted moon. Noted, filed, no action required. That was when Vaynot had understood that the system itself was the problem, not a flaw in the system. The system was functioning exactly as designed. It was designed to insulate the Senate from the consequences of its decisions, and it was performing that function with perfect efficiency. Marcus Calloway had tried to tell them this 12 years ago. He had tried to tell them that the quarantine system was not protection but abandonment, and they had exiled him for it. On the floor, Calloway was speaking again, but his tone had shifted. Quieter now. The hard edge of the casualty figures had given way to something that Vaynot did not immediately recognize in a human voice. It took her a moment. Then she placed it. Weariness, not defeat, not resignation. The specific weariness of someone who had been carrying a weight for a very long time and was not asking for it to be taken, but was simply stating, for the record, that it existed. "I'm going to leave this chamber today," Calloway said. "I'm going to return to my borrowed office on a cargo station in the Rimward sector, and I'm going to continue doing the work that this body voted to stop me from doing. The network will continue to grow. The partnerships will continue to deepen. And at some point, whether it's next year or in 5 years or in 20, this Senate will have to decide whether it wants to be part of what's being built, or whether it wants to watch from these tiers while the galaxy moves on without it." He picked up the data tablet and the sheet of paper. held them both for a moment, one in each hand, the technology of the Senate and the human medium that existed outside it. I didn't come here to win. I came here because 4 species asked me to, and because this chamber deserves to see what it created. You voted to exile me. You destroyed my files. You quarantined the species I tried to help. And the result of all of that, 12 years of it, is a network that works better than anything this Senate has built in a century. He set both items back on the podium, gently, without emphasis. I leave them for the record. He turned from the podium and walked back down the aisle toward the processional doors. He did not look back. He did not wait for Corval's dismissal. He walked with the steady, unhurried gait of a man who had said what he came to say and had no interest in hearing the chamber's response. The doors opened ahead of him, daylight flooding the aisle again, and for a moment his silhouette was framed against the brightness the same way it had been when he entered, except that now the chamber behind him was not watching with the satisfied expectation of a body about to witness a humiliation. It was watching with the particular stillness that meant the humiliation had landed somewhere else entirely. Through the open doors, visible for a fraction of a second before they closed, Vaynot saw something in the sky beyond the atrium. Shapes, dark against the violet-tinged morning. Ships. Not a fleet in any military sense, not warships in formation, but a scattering of civilian vessels, cargo haulers and survey craft, and a small diplomatic shuttle bearing markings she did not recognize, holding position above the Senate complex in the loose constellation of a delegation that had arrived without announcement or fanfare. The Tesseract, the Almari, the Dren, the Cavathi, they had come with him not as a threat, as witnesses. The doors closed. The silence held for 6 full seconds. Then the clicking started, low at first, then higher, then fragmenting into the irregular pattern that meant a chamber in distress. Councilors on the lower tiers were pulling up their holographic displays, accessing the data tablet that Calloway had left on the podium. The figures were already propagating through the chamber's network. Trade volumes and growth curves and partnership agreements appearing on screens throughout the 7 tiers. Thrall was on his feet for a 3rd time. Those vessels are in restricted airspace. I demand an immediate security assessment. The vessels have been cleared through standard civilian approach protocols, the arbiter said, consulting a display. They filed arrival documents through the Trade Port Authority. Their presence is lawful. Thrall's hands curled into fists at his sides. This is a provocation. It is a delegation, the arbiter said, and the flatness of his tone carried a weight that made Thrall sit down. Corval struck his ceremonial staff against the bench. Order, the audience is concluded. The data will be referred to the Trade Analysis Committee for review. It was the correct procedural response. It was also, Vaynot knew, completely insufficient. The data was already on 700 screens. The casualty numbers were already being cross-referenced against intelligence reports that most of these councilors had seen individually but never assembled in sequence. The structure of the informal network was already being mapped by analysts in the lower tiers, who were trained to recognize economic frameworks that fell outside compact templates. And the mapping was producing the same conclusion that the Trade Analysis Division had reached in the classified report that Vaynot had read 4 years ago. The network worked. It worked because it was built on the principle that had gotten Marcus Calloway exiled. Partnership without hierarchy. She sat in her seat and watched the chamber fracture. Not dramatically, not with shouts or motions or the theatrical gestures that marked a legislative crisis. The fracture was quieter than that. It was in the way councilors turned to their seatmates and spoke in low voices, in the way the clicking patterns shifted from tier to tier, some sections falling silent while others intensified, in the way the chemical scent in the air thickened until Vaynot could feel it coating the inside of her throat. She watched Corval confer with the arbiter, their heads closed together, and she saw the tension in Corval's shoulders, the way his hands gripped the edge of the bench. Corval had expected to manage a ritual, a formal audience, a controlled environment, an exile brought back to be seen and heard, and then dismissed so the Senate could confirm its own judgment. Instead, the exile had stood on the dais and calmly, without raising his voice or making a demand, dismantled the premise that had justified his exile in the first place. Then he had walked out, the way humans did, without asking permission, without waiting for the chamber to release him. He had simply turned and left, and the act of leaving, the quiet refusal to wait for the Senate's verdict, was itself a verdict on the Senate. Vaynot remembered another walk, 12 years ago. The walk Calloway had taken after the exile vote was read, when 2 armed marshals had escorted him down the same aisle, past the same tiers, through the same doors. She had watched him then, too, from this same seat. He had walked the same way, unhurried, composed, his back straight and his hands at his sides. He had not looked up at the tiers. He had not sought out the faces of the councilors who had voted against him. He had simply walked, and the only sound in the chamber had been the clicking of 642 councilors, expressing the formal satisfaction of a body that had exercised its authority and found the experience comfortable. She had clicked with them. She had made the sound of satisfaction with her throat plates and told herself it meant justice. It had not meant justice. It had meant relief. Relief that the discomfort was over, that the consensus had held, that she had not been the one to break it. Now the same aisle was empty, and the same doors were closed, and the clicking that filled the chamber was not satisfaction. It was distress. The sound of a body confronting the possibility that its comfort had been purchased at a price it had not known it was paying. Vaynot thought about standing up. She had been thinking about it for 11 months, since the Tesseract petition had arrived, and she had read Calloway's 7-sentence letter, and walked to the window of her office and stood there while the morning light moved across the floor. She had been thinking about it through every committee meeting and every floor session and every private conversation where the Tesseract petition was mentioned and then not mentioned, acknowledged and then deferred, recognized and then forgotten. She had been calculating the cost, the same way she had calculated the cost 12 years ago, except that now the equation was inverted. 12 years ago, the cost of dissent had been too high. Now, the cost of silence was becoming something she could not afford to carry. She thought about the 41 Cavathi dead. She thought about the number the way you think about a stone in your shoe that you have been walking on for months, telling yourself it is small, telling yourself it does not matter, telling yourself that stopping to remove it would slow you down, until one day you stop, not because the stone has grown larger, because you have grown tired of pretending it is not there. She stood up. The decision was not sudden. It had been building for 11 months, layered in the way that geological pressure builds, invisible and incremental, until the surface gives way and what emerges is not the pressure itself, but the shape it carved on the way up. She did not stand because Calloway's words had moved her, though they had. She did not stand because the data on the tablet was persuasive, though it was. She stood because 41 people were dead, and she had read their names in a classified appendix that no one else in the chamber had bothered to request, and one of those names had been a child, an 8-year-old Cavathi girl whose cause of death was listed in the clinical language of intelligence reports as malnutrition secondary to agricultural supply chain disruption. And the supply chain that had been disrupted was the one that the Senate had cut when it quarantined the Cavathi. And the quarantine had been possible because the mutual security framework that would have protected the Cavathi had been rejected 12 years ago when Vaynot raised her hand with 641 others. An 8-year-old girl, a name in an appendix. The motion was small, physically, rising from a seated position in the 4th tier, but in a chamber where 700 councilors were sitting motionless, processing something they did not want to process, the act of one member standing was enough to turn heads. Clicking stopped in the sections nearest to her. Councilors on the third and fifth tiers swiveled their cranial ridges toward her. Thrall, still seated with his fists clenched, turned and stared with an expression that mixed surprise with the first edge of alarm. Corval looked up from his conference with the arbiter. "The chair recognizes Councilor Vaynot," he said. His voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who did not want to recognize Councilor Vaynot, but who could not, under procedural rules, refuse a legislative member's request to be heard during an open session. Vaynot's hands were trembling. She pressed them against the railing in front of her seat and spoke. "Senate President, I rise to request that the Tesseract petition, currently deferred without prejudice, be scheduled for formal debate within 30 standard days." The chemical scent in the chamber surged. Thrall's clicking was audible now, the rapid staccato pattern that meant opposition being formulated. Corval's expression did not change. The scheduling of deferred petitions is at the discretion of the Senate Scheduling Committee. Councilor Vaynot may submit her request through the appropriate channels. I am submitting it now, on the floor for the record. A sound moved through the tiers, not clicking, something lower, a harmonic vibration that the Velori produced when consensus was being challenged in real time. It was the sound of a body that had operated on the assumption that certain things would not be said, discovering that someone was saying them. "Councilor Vaynot," Corval said, and now his voice had an edge, the sharp consonant stress that indicated authority being asserted. "The floor is not currently open for legislative motions. The session was called for a formal audience which has concluded. I'm not making a motion, I'm making a statement. For the record." Corval's hands tightened on the bench, but the procedural rules were clear, and Vaynot knew them the way she knew the layout of her own office. A legislative member could make a statement for the record during any open session. It was a right so basic that it predated the compact itself. "Proceed," Corval said. Vaynot looked down at the empty dais where Calloway had stood. The podium still held the data tablet and the sheet of paper. Two objects, sitting side by side in the column of dome light, one the technology of the Senate and the other a human artifact that the Senate could not control. 12 years ago, she said, and her voice sounded strange to her own ears, thin and steady in the vast chamber. I voted to exile the human envoy Marcus Calloway. I voted with the chamber. I voted with the consensus. I voted because the political cost of opposing the exile was higher than the political cost of supporting it, and because I made a calculation that valued my standing in this body over the merit of the proposal that the envoy had put before us. The clicking stopped, not gradually, all at once. 700 councilors silent. Even Thrall's staccato opposition clicking went quiet, replaced by a stillness that was harder to read and more dangerous. I have reviewed the data. I have read the intelligence assessments. I have seen the trade analysis reports, including the classified rimward assessment that crossed my desk 4 years ago and that I should have brought to the floor then. I did not, because bringing it to the floor would have required me to acknowledge my own error, and I was not ready to pay that cost. She paused. Her hands were still trembling. She did not try to hide it. I am paying it now. The chamber was absolutely still. The envoy's proposal, the mutual security framework that we exiled him for proposing, would have prevented every security crisis that has struck the rimward quarantine zones in the past 12 years. The Tesseract piracy, the Almery colony raid, the Dren blockade, the Cavathi bombardment, all of them. 14 dead among the Tesseract, 211 displaced among the Almery, 47 days of food rationing among the Dren, and 41 dead among the Cavathi. She let the numbers stand in the air. She had read them in reports. She had filed them. She had moved on. And now she was reading them into the permanent record of the Senate, where they would sit alongside the exile vote forever. The threats were real. The proposal was sound. And we rejected it because accepting it would have meant treating humanity as a partner rather than a client species, and this body was not willing to make that adjustment. She looked at Corval, directly, across 4 tiers and the full width of the chamber floor. I was not willing to make that adjustment. I am stating that for the record because the record should reflect not only what this body did but why. We exiled Marcus Calloway because we were afraid of what his proposal implied about our own limitations. We destroyed his files because we did not want the evidence of our error to survive. And we deferred the Tesseract petition because addressing it would require us to confront the fact that an exile operating from a cargo station built something this Senate, with all its resources and authority, failed to build. The silence in the chamber was absolute, not the held-breath silence of a body waiting for something to happen. The deeper silence of a body that understood something had already happened and could not be taken back. Thrall stood. His voice was rough, the clicking undertone of it carrying the ragged edge of a position being defended past its structural capacity. The councilor is impugning the collective judgment of this body based on the claims of an exile with no standing. The proposal was rejected on its merits. The exile was voted unanimously. The councilor's revisionism is not appropriate for the floor. Vaynot looked at Thrall. She had known him for 26 years. She had served on 3 committees with him. Senator Thrall, she said, the exile was voted unanimously because no one in this chamber, including me, was willing to be the first to vote against it. That is not the same as unanimity of judgment. It is unanimity of cowardice. The word landed, cowardice. It was not a word that Valori used lightly, and it was not a word that had been spoken on the Senate floor in living memory. It carried a weight that was almost physical, almost chemical, and Vaynot felt the air in the chamber shift as 700 councilors processed the fact that a sitting member had just accused the entire body, herself included, of the most dishonorable motivation available in the Valori ethical vocabulary. Thrall opened his mouth to respond, closed it, sat down. Vaynot continued, I request that this statement be entered into the permanent record, and I request, formally, that the Tesseract petition be scheduled for debate, not because the exile asked for it, because the evidence demands it. Because 4 species built something in 12 years that we told ourselves was impossible, and they did it with a single human who had nothing but time, and the conviction that partnership was worth more than patronage. She paused, one more sentence, the one she had been carrying for 11 months. And because 41 people are dead who should not be, and this body has not said their names. She sat down. The trembling in her hands did not stop. She did not expect it to. Corval looked at her for a long moment. His expression was unreadable, the translucent skin of his cranial ridge catching the dome light, his wide-set eyes reflecting the 7 tiers of motionless councilors. Then he struck his ceremonial staff against the bench, the sound cracking through the silence like the single stroke of a clock marking an hour that could not be unmarked. Councilor Vaynot's statement will be entered into the permanent record. The request for scheduling will be referred to the scheduling committee. It was the minimum response available, but it was also a concession. The statement was in the record. The words had been spoken on the floor of the Senate chamber in the formal register under the dome, and they could not be unspoken. They would sit in the archive alongside the exile vote, alongside the Tesseract petition, alongside the data tablet and the sheet of paper that Marcus Calloway had left on the podium, and the number 41 that Vaynot had read into the permanent record where it would remain as long as the Senate existed. In the tiers, the clicking resumed, low, irregular, spreading unevenly through the sections. Vaynot heard it and recognized it. It was the sound of a body that was no longer certain, no longer unified, no longer able to pretend that the decision it had made 12 years ago was the decision it would make today. A councilor on the 2nd tier stood, An elderly member of the judicial caste, bone-white robes, ceremonial scars so deep they shadowed in the dome light. Vaynot recognized her, Councilor Yvonne, a jurist who had served 40 years and rarely spoke on the floor. "I wish to make a statement for the record," Yvonne said. Corval's jaw tightened, but the right was absolute. "Proceed." "I also voted for the exile. I also reviewed the intelligence assessments in the years that followed, and I also made the calculation that Councilor Vaynot has described. I support the request to schedule the Tesseract petition." She sat down, the chamber absorbed it, 2 voices, 2 statements, 2 cracks in a wall that had been solid for 12 years. Then a third councilor stood, 6th tier, Trade Regulatory Section. He made his statement in 4 sentences and sat down. Corval struck his staff again. "Order. All statements will be entered into the record. The scheduling committee will convene at its next regular session." It was over, or it had begun. Vaynot was not sure which. She looked at the empty dais. The column of dome light fell on the podium, on the tablet, on the paper. Daylight from above, warm and harsh, the way it had fallen on Calloway's shoulders, the way it had turned his gray hair silver and his plain suit into something that looked, in retrospect, like the most carefully chosen garment she had ever seen. No insignia, no rank, nothing to appeal to, nothing to hide behind. Through the glass dome, the civilian vessels of the Informal Networks delegation were still visible against the violet sky, holding position in the loose constellation of people who had come not to threaten, but to be counted. In the days that followed, Vaynot would learn that her statement had been transmitted within the hour to every diplomatic channel in the Rimward sector. She would learn that the Tesseract government had formally requested a copy of the Senate record. She would learn that the scheduling committee, under pressure it could no longer defer, had placed the Tesseract petition on the debate calendar for 28 days hence. She would learn that 11 more councilors had submitted written statements to the record in the 48 hours after the audience, each one acknowledging the same calculation she had acknowledged, each one arriving at the same conclusion through different arithmetic but the same moral sum. Some of them were councilors she had served with for decades, people whose voting patterns she could have predicted with actuarial precision, and their statements surprised her not because of what they said, but because they said anything at all. The Senate's culture of consensus was also a culture of silence, and silence, once broken, did not repair easily. She would learn that Senator Thrall had submitted a rebuttal to the record, a 7-page document defending the exile vote on procedural and strategic grounds, and that the rebuttal had been read by fewer than 30 councilors before being quietly archived. The document was precise, technically sound, and entirely beside the point. Thrall was defending the legality of a decision whose morality was the question, and the Senate, for once, could tell the difference. And she would learn, through a channel she had not expected, that Marcus Calloway had received word of her statement while standing on the cargo deck of a transport ship in the Rimward sector, a ship that was taking him back to the borrowed office where the work of the network continued. The person who told her said that Calloway had read her statement, nodded once and said nothing. Brevity, the human signature, the thing she had voted to exile and spent 12 years failing to understand. She sat in her office on the 73rd terrace, morning light through the window, a cup of Kellogg cooling beside her hand, and she did not reach for it. She sat with her hands flat on the desk, the way she had pressed them against the armrest when the processional doors had opened and the silhouette had appeared in the threshold, and she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had done. Both things, the vote 12 years ago that had been wrong, and the statement today that had been late. Late but spoken, on the record, under the dome. In the chamber where it mattered. She looked at the light moving across the floor and thought about the word the Valori used for atonement. It was not a word that implied forgiveness. It did not promise resolution or absolution or the restoration of what had been lost. It was a simpler word than that. It meant roughly translated, "I see what I did and I will carry it." She picked up the cup of Kelon. It was cold. She drank it anyway.